Welcome to the Climate and Coordination RCast, where every week we'll be discussing topics related to all things climate change and RChain's role in the solution. We will be discussing technologies that can adapt and coordinate massive amounts of data like never before, forming social architectures that grow collective intelligence, sharing and evaluating data planetarily, all while maintaining personal privacy and personal data ownership. A new decentralized economy is forming as we move from the third industrial revolution, digitization, to the fourth, decarbonization. By building a co-op, built on a correct by construction, concurrent, scalable solution, RChain is structured to build out the new technology that will be required for a flourishing regenerative planet. Please join us on this journey.
Okay, hi everybody, and welcome to the next iteration of the Climate and Coordination RCast from RChain. Today we have a variety of different subjects regarding climate change and blockchain and coordination to talk about, as usual. And it is Juneteenth, which is the holiday commemorating the freedom of the last group of slaves in Texas. So this is a very important holiday that we should all remember. Okay, so the first article that I wanted to bring up, this was from Reuters from June 16th. A few days ago, I stumbled across this in my research for this call this week, and I have to say I'm really surprised about this phenomenon, and I thought it'd be interesting to talk about, and I also feel that there's some potential possibility for a scalable blockchain technology to help with this issue. But anyway, this is a special report from the environmental section of Reuters, written by a woman called Nicola Groom, and the title is "Millions of Abandoned Oil Wells Are Leaking Methane, a Climate Menace." So it's known that there are methane leaks, that there are methane sources of pollution, both natural and unnatural, around the world, and that methane is an extremely potent greenhouse gas, meaning that the same amount of carbon versus methane, you'll find that methane can hold more heat. So basically methane is heating the earth, has the capability to heat the earth faster than carbon. So it's really, really dangerous to be leaking methane if we're talking about keeping the earth at a sustainable temperature, global temperature. Anyway, so this is talking about an oil leak that was found in 2012 in Kentucky, and basically what happened was these people found this leak. It made them sick. They couldn't find any owner of this site, and apparently there was a former owner, a company that drilled for oil there, that had promised them a 12.5% royalty and free natural gas back in 2006, but it says that they never got that. No surprise there. So basically there's this company that was drilling there. They went under. They sold the site to a different company, but both of them deny any responsibility for this leak or for cleaning it up. And they sued and they lost, and it was just a horrible situation for these people. But this is the really surprising part, is that apparently there are millions of these sites around the world that are caused by companies that have gone bankrupt or that have been sold, and these sites are being completely neglected. And it wouldn't be such a huge emergency if they weren't leaking methane, which is, obviously an oil leak is really bad, and all the metal and all the wells and everything needs to be cleaned up, but the methane is really, really dangerous. And anyway, this report from Reuters does a really great job of just explaining how this happened, where the sites are, why it's so difficult to get these companies to clean up their former drilling sites, and how the EPA kind of is part of this entire thing. And there's even a bunch of different pictures which show what abandoned oil drilling rigs, some of them can be very small, use just one little pipe sticking out of the ground, what these sites can look like, and some further damages and action that can be taken. And at the end of the article, it also says that there's an estimate by the U.S. Government Accountability Office that says that it would cost between 60 and 435 billion with a B dollars. So we're talking about potentially upwards of $500 billion to clean up all of these different sites, because apparently to clean up one of them is between $20,000 and $145,000. So the reason I brought this up is that, first off, it's horrifying. Second off, I just didn't realize that this was such a widespread thing with millions of different leaks. I love that this piece really talks about the history of how this happened and the importance of human health. But I really thought it might connect to blockchain, because I feel like, there should be an entity that is keeping track of these kinds of places, so that it doesn't get to this point that we have millions of oil wells that are leaking methane and poisoning people, Native Americans and others. So this is just another potential use case, environmental oversight, and maybe potentially the organization of cleanups is something that I think the blockchain would be really, really good for. And I just wanted to bring some attention to this because it's just such a shocking story. So I would love to get anybody else's thoughts before we move on to the next thing.
Well, interestingly enough, April, so just gone, April was Earth Day. There was a day in April, it was Earth Day 2020. And there was an article on Cointelegraph about industries turning to blockchain to track carbon emissions. But actually, when you sort of think about it in an abstract sense, it could track any emissions. It doesn't really matter whether they're carbon, does it? So there's supposed to be some initiatives ongoing. What they probably don't have is a blockchain with the potential to scale that we have, which is, I think, that's the hard bit. That's been the hard bit for them to achieve. But maybe RChain gets them there. I know that some are using Hyperledger, but that means that it's not a public thing. There is some sort of organization that's central to it, so it's centralized and not decentralized. And of course, that then leads to lack of trust between the domicile of the trusted party and all other domiciles. The beauty of a public blockchain is that trust is just there. That's part of what you get.
Right. And well, clearly there is some trust needed and some organization needed if this is being written about in 2020 and there's already $500 billion potentially of work to be done to clean these places up. And all the methane has been spewing into the environment, heating our planet, poisoning people for years. So it's like, if it's allowed to get that far, then that to me seems like a complete emergency, that it's allowed to get to this point. Do you know what I mean? Like, who did not do their job that this could occur? And and maybe everybody did their job, which just means that we need more oversight, we need more organization, more accountability, more transparency, and then ultimately more investment and action at the end of all that.
Yeah, and what it gets me thinking about the fact that we have reached peak demand, which means that there will be more of these needing to close. And so the problem will kind of continue to grow. We have to make sure that we have a methodology of shutting these things down properly.
That's correct. Completely correct. So here is one more story that I found that also really frustrated me, but made me aware of a situation I was not aware of before. So this is from The Guardian, and for anybody listening that is not aware about the environmental section of The Guardian, I think it's one of the best resources for climate news. The reporting there is very high quality, and it's anyway, I just want to say how much I appreciate The Guardian's reporting on these kinds of things, because you can always find relevant, accurate, well-researched information. So anyway, this is the latest installment in The Guardian for this week. But actually this story comes from last month. This is May 27th, so this is actually a couple weeks old, and somehow I didn't find it in previous weeks. But anyway, this one says, U.S. lets corporations delay paying environmental fines amid the pandemic. So of course, we have these corporations that are saying that they can't afford the fees, and some of that might be true, some of that might be completely untrue. I think you have to take it on a company by company basis, but the story really is about why it is that these companies can break environmental laws. They can spill oil, they can leach toxic chemicals into the air, which contribute to asthma, and of course that would contribute to COVID, let's not forget. And somehow I find it very interesting that these fees, the environmental fees, are the latest, the last to be collected. These people are getting huge breaks when it comes to having to pay these fees, paying these installments. The money that goes from these fees often pays for the cleanup, which can take a long time. And I just find it really interesting that we live in a system that has such a broken system of accountability that the most, I would say, I just can't understand what would be a higher priority than fees to clean up an environmental hazard that could kill people or, destroy land or habitats for wildlife or kill wildlife. And of course, exacerbates climate change. And it just seems like it's such an alarm bell for me that we live in a system that, the public, unless they do, climate research like I do every week for this call, and just in general when I'm reading, you wouldn't really know, that none of these companies are paying their fees. And it's just a really frustrating example of why we need independent, global, that is local and global, put into one, oversight. Because there are astronomical amounts of money that are supposed to be paid to clean up these sites. This article says it's looking at 10 different corporations that have agreed to a total of $56 million between them. So obviously I have no idea if that 56 million works into the other 450 billion of just those leaking methane leaking oil wells. So we don't know about that. But, there's one company that's based in Denver called KP Kaufman. They emitted something called a volatile organic compound that forms smog, which sounds like a great thing to breathe in. The company settled and agreed to pay $1 million in 8 installments over 4 years, but has not been required to pay its second installment. So this is a lot of money that's being, paused. And of course, this same company, KP Kaufman, has spent $200,000, and there's a source on that, lobbying the EPA in 2019 and in 2020. So I'm just curious if anybody has any, any ideas on how this happened. I just think it's so frustrating that these types of emergencies are really not often known to most people in the public. I guess maybe it's human nature to allow a problem to languish until it becomes so incredibly toxic, either politically, financially, or in terms of health, that it has to be dealt with. But anyway, these two stories I thought were just really important to bring attention to, because not only because I feel like there could be blockchain solutions to them around coordinating the cleanup and the oversight of these disasters, which clearly is not being done by Congress or by the EPA, which allows itself to be lobbied by the same companies that are poisoning people. Anyway, I'll pause there just if anybody wants to reflect on this.
Yeah, well, I think that it's really something that we're going to have to confront as a society. The whole idea of not including externalities in your costs, and the externalities that affect the greater population is really absurd. I mean, it's what led to the financial crisis.
Right. And I understand that some of these companies, they have financial trouble paying these fees, but then they shouldn't be in business if they can't afford to pay the fees for the damage that they themselves do. You know what I mean? Like exactly what you said about the externalities. They don't plan for that.
Well,
so,
and I don't think fees are the solution. Ultimately, it has to end at the beginning. It has to, you know what I mean?
right.
It has
Well,
to
the fees
solve.
do, I think, help to pay for the cleanup effort, but you're right. People need to actually care about not doing this in the first place.
Yeah, and that's
let's walk through a little tiny journey. So let's say we build an MVP, and that MVP is a ledger on top of RChain that simply polls every airline to figure out what's flying on any one day, right? So it starts at T plus 0, right? And T plus 1, it's done 2 days because it's done the first day and now it's in the second day. And it's just a ledger that's giving us some computed value of the emissions from aircraft. And if it knows the route of the aircraft, it can also apportion those emissions by state. Let's say we just did the US, right? So the minute you have a framework that gives you a statewide view of the emissions in your area, suddenly people have something to look at and say, well, ooh, ours is much higher than California. We really need to do something about this. I mean, you might catch their attention. And if you had an MVP that did that, at the same time that you're building that MVP, you investigate, how does methane monitoring occur today? And is there a body that publishes those figures? And how often do they get published? Then we could do the same. What makes it different to anything else is it's a public ledger. It is trustworthy. And that's just gathering the data.
Mm-hmm.
Because with COVID, I mean, it's interesting. There's lots of articles out there at the moment. COVID and climate change. Right. On the one hand, COVID's been quite good for climate change because CO2 emissions dropped. But, as we've seen in China, they've come right back up again. So, we know that we can reduce the emissions by having a sort of lockdown. And we know that actually you can actually do it. But how long it lasts is another matter. It's about public order at that point. So, it teaches us some lessons with respect to our ability to react when we really feel compelled to do so. The thing that's different between COVID and climate change is COVID's like more immediate. The timeline that it works on is really rapid. And so you see it in real time, whereas climate change, you don't. So you need some way of capturing the data and making that data relevant and having that data trusted. The minute you've got trusted data on a blockchain, it would have to scale, because you're talking about capturing every flight of every day, potentially in real time if you can, right? Doing the computation and then apportioning, or having a front end on top of this particular ledger on RChain, a front end that somehow graphically shows you what this means to your state.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, Steve, because I think a lot of what you're pointing to is trying to appeal to some kind of ownership, some kind of connection. This is our state, so we bear responsibility. You could also take it home in another way with respect to climate change. You could intersect the genealogy trend. Genealogy has become a popular thing. People that run their family tree backwards towards the in time, and then forward to see who else they might be connected to. And you could imagine something that's like, of you and yours in your family tree, what percentage of your family tree has been impacted by climate change? So just looking at populations that have been impacted, and a lot of people are unaware of the connectivity of these populations, like how much we're connected. Like you're only 2 degrees of separation from some famous historical figure, but also you're typically only a few degrees of separation from someone who has been impacted by climate change, and that number is getting smaller and smaller every day. So a you and yours who has been directly by climate
totally
change.
I think if you do it as a forward genealogy, so if it was me, it's me and my family, right, rather than a backward one, because they're already they're either very old or dead. Right.
Yes.
So,
but you catch more connect.
What will it mean to my grandchildren? If you had a graphic that said the likelihood is that you're going to lose 20% of your grandchildren, that hurts.
There you go. Exactly. Yeah. This is, but the principle that we're looking at is bringing it home in some way. How to make it about you and yours. So in a way that you can feel the immediate impact.
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 problems here. One is, how do you present this, which is what we're talking about, and the other is having a trusted source of that data that you use to represent whatever you represent. So we know we can solve the first one. All we've got to do now is figure out, and I think that's a really good idea of yours, Greg, to solve it that way. Make it so relevant that it hurts, makes you raise your eyebrows.
Yeah, because I mean, I think one of the things that kind of hit me in the gut with these 2 stories is, there's this the shadow of humanity on planet Earth is just so horrendous, right? The figure that we cut across planet Earth is just horrible, and a lot of it has to do with our unwillingness to take accountability, and a lot of it has to do with the strange limitations of our attention. And so I was just rather than throwing my hands up in despair, I was trying to say, well, what can we do with the quality of our attention currently that might make for us to atone for the kinds of things that we've done with planet Earth. And so making it bringing it home, I think, is one approach. Making it about you and yours, or me and mine, or whatever the appropriate phrase is here.
I am minded to look and see if there are APIs for all the major airlines flying in the States, because there's the bringing it home and then tying it to real data, and I suspect that there are APIs, because there's so many consolidator websites that allow you to see flights. If you know the flight, if you know the aircraft, you can look up the weight, you can look up the cruising speed, you can compute the energy that it's going to use.
Yeah, there are a number of climate change kind of startup companies that are allowing people to pay money in order to do a soil restoration, or what's that called? Anyway, some kind of storing of carbon inside soil, and they pay for it based on, their flights. And then the blockchain, some kind of blockchain. Some of these companies are blockchain based and some are not, but there's some kind of formal verification process to know that you offset more than you contributed, which is an
Yeah,
interesting idea.
yeah. I think the sad truth is that every time it's an abstraction, that's that works against the way human attention is organized, except for a very small percentage of people. People need to get their hands back in the dirt in order to appreciate, how miraculous it is. The very soil that we grow our food from is a living entity. And I appreciate all of these different approaches to trying to take some kind of accountability or atonement, but that doesn't land in the heart until you have up close and personal experience. That's my experience and my take on things. I think these kinds of efforts are wonderful, and I think we need more and more people to have some kind of experiential basis, which is I think what Steve was talking about, is like, how do we bring it closer to an experienced reality as opposed to an
Well, and I
abstraction.
agree with that. Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Well, I found the APIs whilst you guys were chatting.
Oh, good.
So
Sweet.
there are APIs. I mean, if you go to Flight Radar 24, right, and then just zoom out over the States, man, it's covered in flights. And there is an API for Flight Radar 24, so we can download. This is real-time data, so the minute we start doing that, we can start doing the computation and storing just the records that we need to on a chain.
Yeah, and just think, if that $500 billion that Nora was talking about was in the hands of people like Elon Musk and other other inclined geniuses, then we might have electric planes. I was just thinking, it's been quite a long time since I stepped on a plane to go anywhere. I think the last time I stepped on a plane, I went to my grandmother's funeral back in December. And it's personally, I really enjoy the experience of getting up off the ground. I get some of my best mathematics done, at 35,000 feet. And I do appreciate the ability to change my impressions, to go suddenly from the beauties of West Seattle to the beauties of Reykjavik. So that's a wonderful thing. But of course, it has dramatic climate consequences, which is why for 10 years I did a travel hiatus. I said I wouldn't take any meetings except through telecommunications. And then after that hiatus, I felt like I'd sort of paid off some of my debt and allowed myself to travel again. But wouldn't it be wonderful if we could approach the problem in a different way by building electric planes or some other kind of solution which is not so, it doesn't have the same kinds of effects on the environment. But that's to say that when we collect these fees, it's part of that can go into building out an infrastructure it's not just about cleanup. We should be thinking about building out an infrastructure that makes it possible to recover the wonderful things about what we've done without the same kinds of impacts on the environment.
Absolutely. And that's so cool that you did a travel hiatus. I didn't know that you did that. That's really awesome. So I know Greg and Daryl both had some different topics they wanted to surface today. So if either of you want to bring those up?
After
That
you,
would be
Daryl.
great.
Well, okay, what I was going to kind of bring to the table today was kind of more of an exploration of the whole idea of the co-op and the future of how the economy is going to go. And it was because I've been watching this speech by Jeremy Rifkin. I'm still on the Jeremy Rifkin thing. He basically describes RChain in this speech. So I thought it'd be kind of interesting to just explore your guys' thoughts about it. So his most recent book from September 2019 is called The Green New Deal: Why the Fossil Fuel Civilization Will Collapse by 2028 and the Bold Economic Plan to Save Life on Earth. So in the book, he talks about how we are rapidly moving from the age of progress to the age of resilience. We're living in a time where a massive sea change is happening before our very eyes. And the shift will be at least as profound as the shift from feudalism to capitalism. So here's an excerpt from a review of the book. A new vision for America's future is quickly gaining momentum. Facing a global emergency, a younger generation is spearheading a national conversation around a Green New Deal and setting the agenda for a bold political movement with the potential to revolutionize society. Millennials, the largest voting bloc in the country, are now leading on the issue of climate change. While the Green New Deal has become a lightning rod in the political sphere, there is a parallel movement emerging within the business community that will shake the very foundation of the global economy in coming years. Key sectors of the economy are fast decoupling from fossil fuels in favor of ever cheaper solar and wind energies and the new business opportunities and employment that accompany them. New studies are sounding the alarm that trillions of dollars in stranded fossil fuel assets could create a carbon bubble likely to burst by 2028, causing the collapse of the fossil fuel civilization. The marketplace is speaking, and governments will need to adapt if they are to survive and prosper. So in the section that I'd like to play for you, he kind of talks about the sea change in thought that is leading to a different way to approach capitalism. And he literally describes RChain in the talk. So I'm just going to share my screen, if I may.
Yeah. Beyond that,
Okay.
in the case of capitalism, when we went to the first industrial revolution, what happened was fossil fuels are the most expensive, and uranium, but fossil fuels are the most expensive energies in the world to explore, extract, ship, and refine. Therefore, we had to create the capitalist stockholding corporation because no monarchy could ever finance extracting fossil fuels for all of civilization. So we set up stockholding corporations, capitalism, so you could have lots of small players invest in shares. All the railroads had to do the same thing. There wasn't enough money without having these shareholding corporations. And when you know an infrastructure, you know, again, where it's going to go because of the way it's engineered. In this case, the first industrial revolution and second industrial revolution were engineered to be centralized, top down, enmeshed in intellectual property. And they had to vertically integrate in order to create economies of scale to return the investment because the fossil fuels were so expensive. Then every other industry that emerged in the fossil fuel culture had to follow suit to have vertical integration and giant organizations in order to return their investment to the shareholders. So in the first industrial revolution, we went to national markets and every nation state. 1776, the steam engine, it all started to come in. Then the American and French Revolution, nation states control national markets. When we went to the second industrial revolution with container ships and jet travel, we went to globalization. And then we created these institutions to mediate, the IMF, the OECD, the World Bank, the UN. And what happens with these centralized infrastructures of the fossil fuel civilization, they are so vertically integrated that here's what we ended up with at the end of the line. 500 global companies, and I've taught many of the CEOs in these companies. 500 global companies, Fortune 500, and these 500 companies represent 1/3 of the entire GDP of the world. That's 500 CEOs. And they only have 67 million workers out of a workforce of 3.5 billion people. Does that tell you something about the inequality? And the 7 richest people on that pyramid this evening, 7 richest individuals on that pyramid this evening, that vertically integrated pyramid, their combined wealth equals the accumulated wealth of 1/2 the human beings living on this planet, 3.5 billion people. It was the nature of the infrastructure that gave you the possibilities, the kind of economic system, and the Soviets did it the same way with vertical integration. They just had it with the state. This third industrial revolution is engineered differently. And so that first generation of millennials in Silicon Valley, your older folks, some of them, I guess your parents or almost, they wanted to take big vertical integration and attach it on to a third industrial revolution that's distributed, open, transparent, because you want to get the network effect. That's how you move it, and you want to laterally scale. So this first generation, Amazon, Twitter, Facebook, they went that way. But what I'm going to tell you, in Greenport, Brooklyn, here in Paris at SAIPO, in Seoul, Korea, in Berlin, we have a Gen Z generation, and they see it very differently. And that is, you're beginning to understand how you can be much more agile if you engage in very high-tech SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. You put them in cooperatives, which are democratic, so the revenue stays with the people within the cooperative, and you blockchain them and scale them virtually and physically anywhere across continents, across the globe. It's much more agile than some clunky, big, giant, vertically integrated organization that's trying to control the whole world and bring all the profit to them. They're going to be gone. They're going to be gone. This is what's in this room at SAIPO tonight. You are the generation that's going to do that.
Okay, so to me, this is describing what the evolution of capitalism is, right? We're moving from vertical integrated systems to a more lateral approach. Whether you call that post-capitalism or whatever, I don't care. Capitalism was amazing. It did an incredible service for humanity. To say that it frees the individual is a total myth now. We need to move on. We need a new system that takes the amazing accomplishments of what capitalism gave us and take it to a whole other level of individual freedom and individual power. And so to me, when he describes the Gen Z movements that are creating these small to medium enterprises, creating co-ops, putting them on the blockchain, I mean, that's RChain. And to me, that is the future of how economies are going to be run. We're the whole idea and the kind of passageway, as he describes, was Silicon Valley with the approach of vertical integration, trying to harness the approach of lateral expansion. And so you have companies like Uber and Airbnb where it's still vertically integrated, and they call it the shared economy or the sharing economy. But it's not, it's like they basically profit off of your house and your car. So the next level of that, it's all in an expansion. So the next level of that is going to be us literally sharing in the ownership of the things that we're building. And so, it's not socialism, that's not socialism. It's actually an extension of capitalism, in my opinion. Or it depends on how you want to define capitalism, but, so anyways, that's my rant. My point is that I think Jeremy Rifkin gets it, and he realizes that if you form a co-op and you put your enterprise on the blockchain, that's the next evolution of our economy.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I love that. Now, several times you have brought something visual for us to enjoy during these calls, which has been really cool. And I saw a funny tweet from somebody, I don't know when it was, past few days, that they said some Americans wouldn't know socialism if it landed a $1,200 check straight into their bank account. And it just made me laugh.
We really do need to get past these binary ways of explaining our economic models, because when we get caught up in these discussions about socialism versus capitalism, those are 20th century discussions. They don't have any relevance anymore. There's too much nuance going on now.
Well, I think they do have relevance, but I see what you're saying, that we things are a little more complicated than a lot of people would like to understand now, and they're also not diametrically opposed necessarily.
That's why I'm not crazy about the term the Green New Deal. I actually don't think it's a helpful term. I don't think it properly describes what needs to be done, and it conjures up an era of the birth of extreme partisan politics, and I don't think it's helpful.
I think the way that it got its name was about the New Deal, which is a highly, I guess, lauded, appreciated, often cited piece of legislation. And I think most pieces of legislation don't really have the title that accurately affects them or that accurately describes them. And I'll just say about the Green New Deal, I think the most important piece of it is there's a piece that talks about having no more disposable people and no more disposable places. And I think that's an extremely relevant idea to what we talk about here, and also really draws the connection, which, I was mentioning Juneteenth at the beginning of this call, but, between racism and environmental exploitation, because you really need to believe that there are disposable people and disposable places in order to extract all of these fossil fuels. And then, of course, that requires racism to do that. So anyway, thank you so much for sharing that. Does anybody else have any comments? I thought it was wonderful.
So one of the things that I thought was nice was that there was a direct connection when you began talking about a shift in an interpretation of capitalism, a shift in the perspective of what's me and mine and what's you and yours, right? And the cooperative model provides a reconciliation, right? So that when we work together, it becomes ours. It becomes us and ours. And that's what I thought was really interesting, was that you're really talking about it's really necessary inside the human experience to have a sense of ownership, to have a sense of belonging, to have a sense of identity as a part of something larger than myself. And until those things begin to line up, there isn't the will to get things done. But once they do line up, then it's amazing, right? Humanity can go to the moon. Humanity can find a bridge to chimpanzees and gorillas, and all kinds of really wonderful things. And I think that what Rifkin is talking about and what you're pointing to is this models reconfiguring this idea of what's me and mine, what's you and yours, and what's us and ours, right? And the cooperative provides a really nice framework for that kind of thing.
Yeah,
it's
I
not.
had a sort of thought about that. To have change on that level, it's very difficult to envisage it. You can kind of envisage a utopia, but you can't envisage the first step often, and that's always the challenge. And recognizing the climate in which a first really significant step would happen. And I think with the climate crisis, with COVID, and with Black Lives Matter, you have almost a perfect storm. And with the American election coming hard on the heels of all of that, you have potentially a perfect storm that would accept change potentially on the level that's required. Because people are now thinking much more about, they're not just thinking about me, they're starting to think about us. And so the notion of collectiveness, of community, of identifying with community, I think is something that's got lost, and it's coming back.
I totally agree. I think that the perfect storm that you're talking about, like it's leading to a sea change, and it's like it's so close I can taste it. And I do agree with Jeremy Rifkin that I think that the leaders of this are going to come from the Generation Z age group. Not to say that you can't be involved if you're older or younger, but it's that demographic that I think is going to really kind of spearhead the change. And to me, like when I think about the idea of a cooperative, I don't really think about it. I think about it in terms of that we all share in the ownership of this thing that we're working together to build. It's to me, it's just like the next evolution of how economies are going to function. And one thing that's unfortunate is co-ops kind of have this kind of reputation that I think we need to get past, because it's kind of associated with, I think, kind of
not profit. That's the issue.
Yeah.
For most, right? But you can have a balance with that. And
Right.
I think the thing that we in RChain bring to that party, which has always been known, and Greg has spoken about it often, it is the coordination technology to enable cooperatives to spring up everywhere and to collaborate with each other, because collectively they become a very undeniable voice.
Well, so we only have a few minutes before the staff meeting, and I did want to mention a few things. One is right to home. RChain has been looking at its own internal coordination technology, and one of the efforts that we've been looking at is the replacing our Discord server with something that runs on RChain. And so to that end, we looked at an open source chat server that's very, very similar to Slack, called Zulip. And in just a few hours, really like one afternoon, one of our members was able to get all the chat data on chain. So the next step, which there's basically one more step that would make it a convincing MVP, which is to have an instance of the chat server read from the chain to populate its database. So once you have that, I mean, there are lots of issues to tackle after that. But once you have that, essentially you have distributed and decentralized the Zulip server, which is not federated yet. Is basically one server per community. So each community sets up a server, and somebody has to trust whoever's managing that server. But with this approach, you now no longer have to do that. You can put the data on chain, and the chain is decentralized, and the different servers can all be federated. So that's a very nice, and what we're looking at in terms of the sort of the MVP level of effort is less than a day, which is really important. And then to get it beyond that is probably 2 or 3 months. But once those 2 or 3 months are done, then it can be done. That effort can be repeated. And we're not talking about 2 or 3 months with a giant team. We're talking 2 or 3 person months to complete that effort, which shows something really remarkable about the technology. The whole point of RChain was to start from the database and the execution model, and revamp that, and then have the payments network, fall out from that. So the payments network is kind of a freebie that comes along with preventing denial of service attacks. So I'm very encouraged, and more importantly, I'm very encouraged because this was done by a community member, right? This wasn't done as by paying a bunch of developers money. This was an effort that was done just by a member of the co-op, and I think that this is the model for how we scale, right? These bite-sized efforts that have massive impact, and being able to make RChain a platform where we can have lots and lots of those accumulating. People can tear off a chunk, and it has a huge amount of impact, and delivers a large value for lots of people. So I'm very pleased with that. And then on a slightly different track, but they are closely connected in more ways than one. Yesterday, Christian Williams, who is one of the collaborators I've been working with on the ladle algorithm, which we've redubbed operational semantics in logical form, presented to a group of MIT mathematicians. There were some fairly notable mathematicians in the crowd, and the work was well received. So I was very, very pleased to see the engagement, and slowly but surely, the results are being picked up by the academy, and that's a long-term process. Essentially we're grateful for any and all skepticism to make sure that it goes through a rigorous quality assurance program that takes many years, but it's happening, it's underway, and we're getting really positive engagement. And right on the heels of that, Mike and Christian and I discovered something new. So Mike and I were talking about a new form of bisimulation and how to calculate a certain aspect of that. And I suddenly realized, oh my gosh, we can use the types that we're generating to type the rewrite rules. Most systems of computation can be characterized as rewrite systems, certainly the pi calculus and lambda calculus, the row calculus, and many others can be described in that fashion. But what hasn't been provided is a typed notion of rewrite. And we can make sense of a typed rewrite system, including a sort of a highly recursive situation where you have types that are only given in terms of the rewrite semantics, governing the rewrite semantics. So that's a really interesting little twist that we can make sense of, and this gives an entirely new expressive framework, much higher level of expressivity, and has interesting consequences in terms of reasoning about the complexity of these systems. So you can use the types to stratify the different notions of computation to ensure that you get to termination or other kinds of complexity characteristics. So this is a new development. To the best of my knowledge, no one's ever proposed this before, and it's just the point of, like, answers to questions are never as interesting as generating new questions, especially especially new avenues of research or new questions that have heretofore not even been thought about, and that's what this work is generating. So that's a very, very good sign.
Reminds me of some advice I got about interviews that somebody told me once, that the answer will be deep if the question is deep.
Indeed.
So anyway,
Nora, it's time to roll us out here because it's 9:30.
Yes. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Please subscribe to RChain on YouTube. Happy Juneteenth. You can become a member of RChain at rchain.coop. And if you'd like to be on this call, email climate@rchain.coop. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.